Okay. And the first half tonight is going to be on the Depression in the United States. So we're sticking with entirely U.S. history for the first half. Then we're going to expand and talk about World War II in the worldwide context. So the Depression and also World War II, these are giant topics that we're going to try to cover in about an hour, which is ridiculous and tragic. I mean, these are topics that scholars and people spend their entire lives studying the details of. I mean, if you go to university, you can take an entire semester-long class just talking about the Depression, how it was created, what the government response was, the long-term effects of this stuff. So there's a huge amount of detail that we're going to skip past. We're going to stick to the highlights and, again, try to get through it in about an hour or so. But when we last left off with the United States, at least, the Depression has started to emerge with the Wall Street crash. The investment bubble pops in October 1929, and it goes down. Just like today, when it goes down pretty far, a lot of investors think, oh, they're getting a good deal on stock prices, so they start buying. So it actually does go up a little bit, but then it plunges again. It goes up a little bit, it plunges again. So that's a cyclical type of thing, and this is what the long-term trend looks like going into 1930. So this is 1929 going into early 1930. So even in those first few months of the crash, you see it is pretty volatile. And if you look at the charts on the 2008 crash, you see a whole lot of very similar things. The stock crash, though, did not cause the Depression. It is a first step. And we talked about last time how this creates layoffs, right? Because you have stock owners, boards of directors that largely own these companies, own the vast majority amount of the stock. And their number one goal is to keep the stock high because that's their investment. They want to be able to sell it in the future for at least the same price they bought it for. So when their stock prices start going down, they desperately try to find any way of proving to the public that their company is solvent, that it's going to be able to make money in the future, to theoretically convince people to continue buying their stock, to at least keep it level, if not raise the value of the stock. So in order to prove to the public that their company is solvent, that they're going to start becoming more efficient in their production, they start laying off workers to cut costs. And that's where the real cycle gets going. These companies start laying off workers. People become unemployed. Therefore, there's a lot of workers who are not making paychecks anymore, which means they don't have money to go off and buy all the stuff that they used to buy. They're not buying the radios and the refrigerators and the cars and the clothes. So popular spending starts to slow down, which means if you're a refrigerator making company, your sales start to slow down because there are less people buying, you are selling less. Your stock price starts to go down, and the owners say, in order to convince the public we are solvent, we'll lay off some workers. So the bomb hits, the stock crash hits, and the ripple effects are corporate panic, layoffs, and the drop in consumer spending. And this becomes a self-destructive cycle. This becomes a whirlpool that drags the whole economy down as more and more people are laid off. That starts sending the United States into a recession. It becomes a worldwide phenomenon in 1931 when European banks start to fail, especially some of the central ones, one in Britain, one in Germany. They go bankrupt. And now there is an international money panic, an investment panic. At that point, Germany and some of the other countries, like Britain and France, in the early 30s start saying that they cannot pay back their debts from World War I and the other loans that were piled on top in the 1920s we talked about last time. So now the government, the U.S. government, is going to have trouble, and U.S. businesses are going to have trouble with their bottom line. So this cycle of unemployment, lower spending, bank failures goes international, and the Depression really starts to emerge in a big way in about the spring of 1931. The U.S. Federal Reserve, the central bank, makes the mistake of restricting the money supply. In the mass crisis we've seen the past few years, The Federal Reserve has increased the money supply. They've been printing money like crazy. Because the theory is that the more money is out there in society, the more people will buy and sell things. So the economy will theoretically grow. So today there is a knee-jerk reaction against recessions for the Federal Reserve to just start sending money out to society. In 1929, 30, 31, 32, the Federal Reserve did the exact opposite. And this is stuff that is very heavily studied today. What did the Federal Reserve do? What was that mistake, and how did that contribute to the rise of the Depression? And there's a general theory that the U.S. factory system has reached its height of efficiency. Their machines, their workers are cranking out huge amounts of goods. The problem is not production. That system can still produce huge amounts of stuff. The problem is consumption. Workers don't have enough money to buy all the stuff being made, therefore prices are going down, company profits are going down. Does that make sense? There is oversupply of the market. So those are the many systematic things that lead up to and create the Great Depression. The sitting president at the time is named Herbert Hoover. He won the November 1928 election. He was a Republican, while the Republican Party and the country, and largely internationally, are riding high on this tide of prosperity. So when he runs for the presidency in 1928, he says that we have solved the problems of recession. We have prosperity in our time, and prosperity maybe forever. He is inaugurated in March of 1929, and then 6 months later the stock crash hits and he has to deal with the repercussions. Hoover has a theory of government that was very dominant in American politics, going all the way back to at least the 1890s. And the theory went that it is not government's responsibility to care for the people in one of these emergencies. So this goes back to the early 1890s with President Cleveland's statement. It is the people's job to support the government, but not the government's job to support the people. So Hoover and other economic thinkers from this kind of school of thought basically say the working classes are on their own. If they have trouble making ends meet, if they start going without food, then we have a lot of charities in the country that are supplied by wealthy donors, and it's the jobs of those charities to meet the needs of the people. That this is not government's job. So there is not really much of any unemployment compensation. Social Security doesn't even exist. Workers' compensation largely doesn't exist. I mean, most workers weren't even permitted to form unions in their companies. Companies could kill that. They could stop it still in the 1920s. So Hoover gives these statements. He creates some government bodies to try to deal with the rising depression. There's a Federal Reconstruction Board that tries to take Federal Reserve money and try to direct it into specific industries to prop them up and keep them growing, to hold up the whole U.S. economy. That one largely fails. So he wants to rely on wealthy people to be generous to the American population and do something for the people. His other policy is to call meetings of corporate leaders, the big employers like Ford Motors, the big companies. Call them to the White House and have meetings with these CEOs. And in these meetings, and sometimes he brings 20 or 30 of them in at a time, he gets them to promise to not go into mass layoffs. Hoover says, look, there is a dip in the economy. Your companies are going to take a financial hit. Your profits are going to take a hit. And it is wise for you to accept that loss in the short term without firing people. Because if you start the mass layoffs, that's going to start us into the whirlpool, and we don't know how to drag our way out of that. And during these meetings, the corporate leaders say, yes, we agree, we will not start the mass layoffs. We will take the financial hit to our profits. With the longer term view, if we keep these people employed, then we can pull ourselves out of the recession. The problem is, then they go back to their executive boards and their boards of directors, and they seem to forget their promise. They start the mass layoffs. Yeah?
Was it a mutual agreement, or was it something actually signed?
I don't know if it was signed. That's a tough one. I haven't seen any documents that were signed. It seems to have been a kind of honor system.
They just said we promise and that's it?
Mm-hmm. And Hoover watched this happen as these companies start the mass layoffs, and he throws his hands up in the air and says, what happens? You made the promises, and eventually the pressure for profit, which is what CEOs' jobs are determined by, right? Your number one job as a CEO, to make money for the company, make money for the investors. Hoover gives out a famous quote where he says that capitalism is not the problem here. He says capitalism is a good system and a prosperous system. He says the problem is not the system itself, it is the leaders who run it. The problem is not capitalism. The problem is individual capitalists because, quote, they're too damn greedy. They don't have a long-term vision. They are obsessed with short-term profit. And when they're that obsessed with kind of short-sightedness, they will often make dramatic mistakes and sometimes even cut their own throats in the long term because they don't think about the long term. So Hoover was hugely disillusioned and angry with these corporate leaders. Other questions? Okay. Unemployment rates start to rise. 1930, you've got around 7 or 8%. When the Big Depression hits, unemployment skyrockets by 1931. And that's a problem for Hoover because 1932 is his re-election year. And by 1932, you're talking about 20% unemployment. 1 out of every 5 workers that are actively looking for jobs, which is how we define unemployment. It's basically a kind of economic poll. Are you out of work? Are you looking for work? They only measure employment by the people who say they're actively out looking for jobs. So it's a misleading statistic. There are other ones that are much more accurate, joblessness statistics, basically. But as 1932 gets closer, Hoover's going to run for re-election with 20% unemployment. That's going to hurt him politically, obviously. Does anyone know what the unemployment rate in the United States is today?
8.
Yeah, around 8. So in the depths of the Depression, about 1933, 32, 33, it gets up to 25%. So imagine it 4 times as worse, or 3 times as worse as it is right now. And you start to see people lining up for whatever government assistance is available. Whenever any job, just like today, is advertised, they get hundreds and hundreds of applicants. These are employment agencies. You can see the guys crowding outside trying to get work. And you see this guy out in the street saying, I'm not looking for a handout, I'm looking for a job. I'm willing to work, I have experience working. So it's not like I'm just going to sit on the couch and collect my money and laugh all day long about it. And you often get these kind of statements today, obviously. One group that was particularly vulnerable were the World War I veterans, the soldiers who had fought and come back home. A lot of them were wounded, hurt in one way or another. And the federal government, when the war was over, had promised a lot of these now former soldiers, as they're trying to go back into the workforce, the government said, as you near your retirement, 25 years from the end of the war, 1920 or so. So when you get close to like the mid-40s, the mid-1940s, you're getting close to your retirement, the government will give you a bonus for having fought in the war. The government will give you a cash bonus, a payout. And a lot of these former soldiers start getting together in small cities and towns all over the country, and they say, we need our bonus payment now in order to survive. And they gather together and they have a march on Washington. So they go to Washington, D.C., they are known as the Bonus Army, and they converge on Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1932. They hold meetings At least they try to hold meetings with the President of the United States. They hold meetings, or they try to, with leaders of Congress, because Congress is going to be the group that's going to vote on whether or not to actually pay these guys. These politicians don't want to meet with these soldiers. This is embarrassing, and eventually the law proposed to give these guys money is voted down in Congress. It does not pass. But these guys have brought even military equipment. They brought tents, and they literally occupy an area just outside Washington, D.C. called Anacostia Flats. And this is what the encampment looks like. When the law is voted down, President Hoover gives the order to these guys to evacuate the encampment and go home. Their project has failed. There's no point in them staying. They didn't want to stay because many of them didn't have homes to go back to. So it appears that the president gave an order to a U.S. general to convince them to leave. And it appears that this general went a little bit overboard and sent in the army with machine guns and flamethrowers and literally burnt this thing down. So this is a hugely controversial thing. This is the U.S. Army attacking its own men. The Hoover administration tries to play it off. It's not really our fault. This is more the general, and it's not all that bad, but it's pretty bad. This is front page news. This is national news. This is international news. Lots of people in the world are reading about this. And Hoover, the Republican, is still running for re-election, and the Democrats basically look at this and say, "We got this election. This is political suicide." So the Democrats are very aware that really whoever they nominate for the presidency, for the Democratic nomination for president, when they meet at their convention, they know they're basically picking the next president of the United States. There is no illusion about that really at all. And the guy they eventually choose is the governor of New York. His name is Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt, like many politicians, he basically, during the election, sits back. He doesn't say much. He doesn't give many big policy statements, just like presidential candidates today, obviously. He's very vague on a lot of things. Because he knows that Hoover, the more Hoover does, the more Hoover messes up. Roosevelt basically decides to sit back and watch Hoover destroy himself with all the mistakes. There is one statement, though, that President Roosevelt gives in San Francisco at a place called the Commonwealth Club, where he lays out some ideas that come to be known as his basic economic philosophy. So many historians, when they're going back into his speeches from the election, from the campaign, they pick out this one in particular and say, this is what gives us the clearest indication of what he intended to do. Again, he didn't want to talk about it publicly because he's almost guaranteed to win. The more he talks in detail, the more he might embarrass himself or make some people mad. So he's very vague for the most part. But the Commonwealth Club speech, he says that literally only about 600 corporations run the entire U.S. economy. Roosevelt says that that's a bad thing. This is consolidation. This is too much wealth and power in too few hands. This is monopolization. And Roosevelt predicted that it would only get worse from there unless something was done. He predicted by the year 2000 that only about 50 or so corporations operated by only about 12 or so different individual people would run the whole U.S. economy. So he said this is only going to get worse, so this is the kind of time, this is the opportunity for government to step in, for the people to rise up and say, we don't want this level of monopoly anymore. This is untrustworthy. This is destructive. Roosevelt says that the problem of the Depression, and it was already starting to be called the Great Depression even by then, The Depression's problem is not the result of productivity. The factory system is still efficient and can be efficient if you just hire the workers back and ramp up the factories again. So Roosevelt says that the major problem with depression is how do you fairly distribute all the gains of industrialization to the population? How do you bring the working class into this prosperity? How do you use the factory system to help the average people, not just the rich? And he says that the U.S. government historically have been driven toward land conquest and imperialism. That was the American story all the way up until the early 1900s and World War I, and even the 1920s. He says that the Depression is a turning point in American history because the American people should no longer be interested or obsessed with getting more land or territory or international power. He says the new test of the United States is going to be the fair administration of the economy. Again, how do you make the economy work for the average people? Not just allow the profits to accumulate almost entirely at the top amongst the richest people. So he says, much like Hoover, the Depression is not the result of a bad system. Capitalism, in his mind, fundamentally is a good thing. It is a driver of prosperity and of innovation. But he says, much like Hoover, the problem is with the individuals who run it. The capitalists, on an individual personal level, are often just too greedy to be trusted. So Roosevelt said that the new challenge for the federal government is to basically take control of the national economy away from the greedy capitalists and start to administer the economy, to run the economy for the benefit of the people and to avoid these kind of crashes and problems in the future. Basically, the capitalists, the CEOs had their chance and they blew it. And everything that's happening in the Depression is just proof of how desperately the people need government to take a big hand in this. So questions about any of that? Just remind you of any other theorists in general that we've gone over already? And this stuff is approaching Marxism. Marx would have never said that capitalism is a good thing, and he in fact did need to find capitalism as the kind of root evil of the world. But this is a very liberal interpretation, and is obviously at least tending toward socialism. And Roosevelt was openly accused of being a socialist, just hiding in the Democratic Party. And the Socialist Party is still around, right? The American Communist Party. The Communist Party of the USA is a party at that point. And because there is so much criticism of capitalism and what it had created for the Depression, socialism and communism start becoming very popular in the United States as people look for alternatives. So a lot of Americans pick up Karl Marx's books and read them and feel that Karl Marx was telling the truth. So the Communist Party starts to grow its membership very quickly. And the Socialist Party gets a large chunk of the vote in these elections. Okay, so Roosevelt is pretty overwhelmingly elected. He's a Democratic nominee. He wins the election of 32, so he will be inaugurated in March of 1933. By that point, there was a whole other problem rising in the United States, and this was the rumor of bank failures. Banks existed back then much as they do today. If you want to cash your paycheck and you don't want to hide money underneath your mattress because you're afraid of being robbed or something like that, or you want to put your money into some kind of bank account that could make interest, people took their paychecks, put them into the bank. The problem was when you work for many years and say you have thousands or tens of thousands of dollars saved in the bank, what happens if that bank goes bankrupt, goes under? That bank doesn't keep your money in its vault. It makes loans with that money. So it builds houses, invests in businesses. So that money just isn't sitting on hand. They're forced to keep a certain amount of cash on reserve in case you want to go in and pull out a little bit of your money to go out and party on a Saturday or something. But the problem in the Depression is that when the European banks start to fail, they start to go under, rumors start spreading that your own local bank is going to go under. So what do you do as fast as possible? Yeah, you go to your bank and you take all your money out as much as you can. Because if you have $10,000 in that bank and it goes bankrupt, you just lost everything, your whole life savings. So when these rumors would spread through a town, you would often be walking down the street and just see one person run toward the bank, and then everyone runs toward the bank as fast as possible. Because when you see one person run, that's an indication, right? That one person is going to get their cash, and if you're late, you're going to lose. So these were called literally runs on banks, because people literally ran to the bank to get their money out as fast as possible so they didn't lose everything. And this was becoming an epidemic in the United States. And banks were destroyed just based on rumors. Has this happened today? Yes, there were banks in Pasadena in 2008 that were destroyed by just popular runs, people going to the bank all on a Tuesday afternoon trying to get their money out. So this stuff has happened since. When Roosevelt goes into office in March, the first thing he does, he gives a speech to the American people saying, we're going to close all the banks for 8 days, 8 business days, in order to stop the rumors. I mean, this stuff spread on immediate fear. So if you close the banks for a while, people would hear the rumor of the bank going under, and if you can't get to the bank for a few days because it's closed, then the rumor would kind of dissipate. People would feel more calm, and theoretically they wouldn't do the run when the bank opened again. And to guarantee they didn't do a run on their local banks, Roosevelt, who carried large Democratic majorities in Congress in 1932, he pushes through a major fundamental reform of the banking system called FDIC. This is a federal insurance agency, basically, that insures the money that you have deposited in banks up to a certain amount. Does anyone know what that amount is today?
Is it in the 200,000s?
$250,000. So if you have $250,000, you can put it in the bank, and if that bank goes under, theoretically, the federal government will step in and pay you your money. That's the law. So this is called FDIC for short, and any bank who has signed onto the system, they have to pay a small fee to the federal government to be signed onto this kind of insurance system. They openly and proudly portray it on their doors and at the little teller signs and stuff. See FDIC everywhere, and that's exactly what it means. If you put your money in there, theoretically, you are insured against loss. What they won't tell you is that today the FDIC only has enough money, the federal government only has enough money planned for if 5% of the bank accounts go under. So if they all go under all at once, you might get 5% in your cash. And that's been a problem for quite a while. They keep on lowering the amount that they keep on reserve, thinking that this stuff won't happen anymore, but here we are. Okay, so that's FDIC. The Roosevelt administration with Congress also starts pushing through recovery programs. The Depression and the New Deal that rises, or Roosevelt's policies to deal with the Depression, can really be broken up into 3 major categories. Reform of the old system that broke, that caused the Depression. Relief and recovery for the individual people that are out of work. So this is one of the kind of relief programs. This is the NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act, is probably one of the more extreme liberal things that the Roosevelt administration did. This literally says that corporations and capitalists cannot be trusted to run important industries in the United States. You cannot just be laissez-faire government anymore. You cannot just let businesses do whatever they want because they're too greedy. So NIRA says that, number one, they're going to allow unionization. So that's part of NIRA. Number two, it says that in order to guarantee stability in a certain industry, the owners of companies and the workers will have to come hold meetings with government mediators to come up with plans for production. So if you're working in a meat packing plant, your union leaders and your ownership leaders are going to go to federal government mediation, basically, to try to hash out a deal about how much meat is going to be produced. And this goes into a whole lot of industries. It even makes it into Hollywood. Actors unions and stagehand unions get together with movie studios, and they have mediation under a federal judge to decide how many movies they're going to produce every year to guarantee employment and guarantee profit for the company. So this is becoming a controlled economy to a certain extent. Of course, it's the federal judge or the federal mediator is only there to ensure that these two sides come to a deal. The mediator usually doesn't just create a deal for them. It's a negotiation between ownership and employees, managers and workers. But these codes are created under federal government power to try to deal with the Depression, to try to stabilize things, to make things predictable, and to give somewhat guaranteed work to workers. So NIRA was very popular amongst workers because they were allowed to unionize and they're going to start getting guaranteed contracts and whatnot. Often, though, very unpopular amongst owners because they see their profits being restricted. Another thing that the New Deal does is create, and you're going to see a whole lot of different acronyms, this kind of alphabet soup of different identities, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which takes federal money and renegotiates farm mortgages. A lot of farmers, when the price of food started going down, started losing their farms because they weren't making enough money to make their mortgage payments. So this will renegotiate farmer mortgages and often use federal money to pay off really overpriced mortgages to keep farmers out in the fields raising food for people. And also, because they want to prop up the price of food to give farmers guaranteed profits so they can keep their farms, they pay farmers to not grow things. Because if you have an oversupplied broccoli or carrot market, if there's way more carrots out there than people want to buy, then the price of carrots goes down, right? The best way of dealing with that, because you can't really control the demand very much, you control the supply. You only allow farmers to grow so much. And the federal government literally paid farmers to leave some areas of their farm unplanted. This is popular with a lot of farmers because the price of food starts to rise again. They start getting more money and they can pay their mortgages. But unpopular with who? Everybody else. Because in the Depression, people are starving. Unemployment, families going hungry, it's just awful. Millions and millions of people are hungry. And now you have the federal government paying farmers to not raise food. So a lot of this one is hugely unpopular throughout the country. This is an outrage. Another law is passed called the Federal Emergency Relief Act, which creates a new bureaucracy that creates a whole lot of sub-levels to basically hire unemployed workers to do certain things that the government wanted done. Largely build roads, build hospitals, build electricity plants, build schools, or rebuild schools that are falling apart. So the Civil Works Administration, the Public Works Administration, the Works Progress Administration, you get all these different identities, and they're largely doing very similar things. They're building public infrastructure. They are fixing highways, they're building telephone lines, and this happens all over the country. This employs millions and millions of men. And in the Depression, it's still a very sexist society. Women are largely not in the workplace outside of being like secretaries or elementary school teachers or nurses or something. That's really the only fields open to women socially. So when you're talking about unemployment, it's overwhelmingly men. Civilian Conservation Corps is a little bit different. This hired men to go into the national forests and replant trees. And cut down trees that may be a little bit dangerous if you leave them standing. These things are very, very popular because this is giving people jobs. They become government employees. And a lot of the public infrastructure that we have today is built in the 1930s under this system. A lot of the older schools you see with their kind of limestone floors and whatnot. They're kind of fake marble floors, limestone walls, stuff that's all cracking and falling apart now. That's all built in the 1930s. So questions about those at all?
Did Prohibition end during this time?
Yep. Prohibition is repealed in 1933.
Under Roosevelt or under...
I'd have to look at the exact date where the amendment, because they have to amend the Constitution to do it. I have to look at the exact date that the amendment passed. I don't know if it's in the couple weeks before he took office.
But it was done in order to kind of help the whole economy thing out, right?
Not just that, but alcohol's popular. And a lot of politicians who are being blamed for the Depression are, in these elections, are desperately going to start looking for some issue they can send to the American people to become popular again. Yep, it's a political thing. They don't do it to make a better society or, make our world safer or anything like that. They do it because they want to get reelected. That's really the power of democracy. If your politicians are doing something you don't like, write them a letter, give them a call, do something like that. Let them know and tell them, if you don't do what I want, I will never vote for you again. I will motivate all my friends to vote against you. I have a big mouth and I'll tell as many people as I want, or as many people as I can, to vote against you. That's how you get politicians to do things. You start mass movements against them. You threaten them. And that's largely how the repeal of Prohibition came about. That was almost impossible to enforce because people like alcohol. No matter what it is, if people like doing it, they will find a way to do it in secret where the government won't be able to track them down.
Something similar is going on right now with marijuana, right?
And a lot of different things. You can make a whole list of things that the government has made illegal that people still do. Because, if you do it quietly in your house, you can probably get away with it. Right? And that's just the reality of the world. Okay, some of the guys in the Civilian Conservation Corps literally going off into the forest and replanting, doing all kinds of things to largely rebuild the national forests. WPA employee getting his paycheck. And this is a famous photograph. These were emotional moments for guys. Because some have been out of work for 3 or 4 years and their families are starving. So getting a weekly paycheck again is a big, big psychological thing to these guys. And as they make enough money to survive, who gets the credit for this stuff? Not just government. Roosevelt personally. The working classes largely view Roosevelt as a hero. He is the person who gave them personally jobs so that they could live. And just the idea of having a job is kind of becomes a heroic thing in the 1930s. This is where baseball players get famous for not taking a day off for 12 or 13 years. Just the very fact that they clocked in and went to work every single day consistently. They become national heroes. Okay. Other kinds of reforms meant to avoid the kind of catastrophe of 1929 and the years after. So there's a lot of government reforms set up to stop this from happening again. Not just relief for the people that are affected, but actively trying to prevent a similar occurrence. because a lot of this was happening on Wall Street, the Wall Street crash was kind of the first step into this mess. Congress passed the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission. This is a basically police force for Wall Street that watches out for insider trading. Secret deals between traders to push up the value of the stock. They go off and buy millions of shares of a company and inflate the price of the stock, so as the price rises, they sell their shares before anybody else and they make a bunch of money. Then they don't really care what happens to the stock after that. Companies were driven to bankruptcy by these kinds of stockbroker conspiracies. So the SEC is set up and exists today to prevent that, and obviously not doing a very good job today because they're so underfunded. The presidential administrations over the past few years just haven't given the SEC enough money to do investigations. Number 2, another law is passed called the Wagner Labor Relations Act, which again guarantees workers the right to unionize and have collective bargaining with their employers. So it becomes illegal for companies to fire workers when workers start talking about forming a union. And this is still law today.
Illegal for what?
Make it illegal for employers, owners of companies, to fire or otherwise intimidate workers when they talk about forming a union, when the workers start gathering to form a union. Again, another law that just generally is not enforced anymore because you have a lot of people being fired for talking about joining unions. And there's some particular companies that do it consistently. And sometimes they have to pay a small fine or something to the federal government, but that's pennies compared to what they would have to pay unionized workers. Third one is called the Banking Act of 1933, that popularly becomes known as the Glass-Steagall Act, which created a literal firewall of separation between depositor banks, where the average working people took their paychecks deposited in a bank, to prevent those banks from taking your deposits and going off and buying huge amounts of stock on Wall Street and doing other kinds of risky investments. So a major separation is created between the banks that you would use to deposit funds and what we call investment banks that are built solely to go off and do a lot of that kind of risk-taking on Wall Street and large investments and whatnot. Because if those investments go bad, you don't want people's paychecks being lost when those banks go down. And again, obviously, another law that's not being enforced today. Does anyone know why it's not being enforced? Because it was repealed in 1999. And there's a lot of talk today, if you listen to radio or debates on television, about bringing the Glass-Steagall Act back. Because it was so successful for so long. You don't see one of these giant stock crashes that takes down the whole U.S. economy basically very quickly. Just didn't happen for a good 65 years because that law is in place. You take that law out and 9 years later, there you go. And again, they go forth and Roosevelt pushes through the Social Security Act, which creates deductions from worker paychecks to create an amount of money that would be useful for people when they retire or if you get hurt on the job. So that one's obviously still around. All you have to do is look on your paychecks and it'll be there. SSI. Social Security Insurance. Or SSDI. Social Security Disability Insurance Deductions. Yeah.
Is that true that's going to run out soon?
It won't run out soon. That debate happens when you have a whole bunch of people being born after World War II. So if you set up a system where you have a predictable amount of workers paying a predictable amount into the retirement. When they retire, everything should run smoothly as long as you have a consistent amount of workers to retirees. Does that make sense? Consistent levels. What happened in the 50s, and they're born in the 50s, so now they're starting to retire, right? They're getting to their 60s. You're starting to get a glut of retirees. So what happens when the workforce remains the same, but they're paying out more benefits to a whole lot more retired people? And systems were adopted in the 80s to deal with that. They basically raised the deduction amount, the tax, to build a glut of money to pay those people out and to deal with it. But it's questionable if that money is still in existence or if it's been spent on other things already.
Were those people the baby boomers?
Yep, that's what they call the baby boomers. So we'll see what happens in probably about the next 10 to 15 years if Social Security is still around. I mean, the payouts have started. They started in 2010. So that's another thing. And if you watch the, say, presidential debates, both sides say, we're going to stabilize Social Security. How are you going to do that? Chirp, 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 chirp. They never give any detailed plan. There's Roosevelt signing the Social Security Act. Does in 1935, the year before he runs for re-election. There are a lot of complaints against the New Deal. Roosevelt runs for re-election in 36, overwhelmingly re-elected because he has the support of the working masses. One of the major complaints about the New Deal is that it was very costly. You're building up huge amounts of government programs. The amount of government employees absolutely skyrockets. So the national debt as a percentage of GNP, which means gross national product, the size of the whole economy as they understood it back then, the national debt as a percentage of the whole U.S. economy was around 20% going into the Depression. Then Roosevelt goes into office and boom, you get a pretty immediate raise in the size of the national debt compared to the rest of the economy. It doubles because the economy is shrinking and the government is growing, right? It's not the size of the government doubles, it's relative to the economy, so it's kind of economic measures. But the New Deal is expensive, there's no doubt about it. Roosevelt and the Democrats said it is worth it because this is a hopefully short-term problem that we can fix with large employment, give people money, they can start buying things again, so factories will make more stuff, they'll hire more workers, we'll pull our way out of the Depression. But it stays at about 40%, you see, until we get to World War II, and then it really goes up to about 125% of the national economy. 125, 130, somewhere around there.
Who were they borrowing the money from?
Anybody. Anybody who has money that wants to buy treasury bills and get guaranteed profit through interest rates. Individual companies, wealthy people, foreigners, doesn't matter. They'll take money from anybody. They'll take your $20 if you want to go buy a treasury bond. I think the cheapest one is $50. You can buy one for 6 months and basically you say, I'll buy this $50 treasury bond, I'm going to pay $46 for it, and when I sell it back to the government I get $50, so you get $4 in profit.
After the 6 months?
After the 6 months. That's the interest applied. Yeah. But when you're doing that, say, I have $10 million sitting around. I want to go buy a 6-month or a 5-year bond. When you pay back the interest on something like that, I mean, that could be $1 million or $2 million. So when you're talking about big investment, you can talk about big return.
In that short of a time? In that short of a time?
Yeah, there's all kinds of different terms. I think the shortest one is 6 months, and it goes to a year, 2 years, 5 years, and beyond that. You can usually strike your own kind of deal. But those are the kind of shorter, systematic ones. Yeah, and you could do that with whatever money you have saved right now. It's guaranteed profit.
It's guaranteed.
Yep. Yep. Okay, so there's a lot of politicians who speak out against the New Deal. A lot of them said it was just too expensive. This is going to bankrupt the government. They had an argument there. This was very expensive and far more expensive than anything the U.S. government had ever done in its past. So they say this is a big turning point in American history, and who knows how long the rich will continue loaning us money. There are several politicians Lemke is, I think, a congressman from North Dakota. His big complaint against the New Deal is that the farmers weren't getting enough. He's from North Dakota, so who else is he going to advocate for? Charles Coughlin is a fairly racist type of preacher who especially didn't like Jews, apparently. Said that the Depression was getting expensive and it wasn't doing enough for the poor. And Huey Long is a senator from Louisiana who said very much the same thing. It's not going far enough in providing relief for the people who need it. But Roosevelt is overwhelmingly reelected in 36. He defeats a lot of these arguments. Probably the most effective stop on the deal, on the New Deal, Roosevelt's program, is the Supreme Court. The court is unelected. Once someone gets onto the Supreme Court, they serve until retirement or death. They're never reelected. They're never voted on. They're there as long as they want to be there, or as long as they can hold out and live. So the Supreme Court by the 1930s was appointed by conservative politicians from sometimes the 1800s. I mean, sometimes these judges sit on this court for 30 or 40 years. So some of these judges are still very much kind of pro-business thinkers that are out of line with a lot of politics of the Roosevelt administration, a lot of popular feeling. So they don't like the New Deal very much, and systematically they start striking down as unconstitutional some of the New Deal provisions. And the biggest one they killed was NIRA. After years of negotiating all those codes and putting them into effect, the Supreme Court, in a lawsuit, declared NIRA unconstitutional. So everything it had done was wiped out, not allowed to exist anymore.
What was the NRA?
The National Industrial Recovery Act, the one that's mediating between worker groups and industry owners. So all that ends because they say that is unconstitutional. In 1936, there's also a lawsuit against Social Security. And that seems to be the next one that the Supreme Court is going to go after. And Roosevelt is pissed off. And he looks to do something to take control of the court or to intimidate them. He has reinaugurated his second term in March of 37 and immediately proposes what he says is a plan to make the court more efficient. His argument is basically, there's a whole bunch of old guys on this court. They're not very quick anymore. So we need some younger guys on the court to, get quicker decisions, basically, make it more efficient. So his proposal is to pass a law to give the president the power to appoint a new Supreme Court justice for every single one that's already on the court who's over 70 years old and did not retire. And the public largely turns against Roosevelt in this instance. They view it for what it is, his attempt to take control of the court just by numbers. Because if this one goes through, he's going to get a lot of appointments. And he's going to appoint his friends and defenders of the New Deal to the court and get whatever he wants from the court also. And a lot of the American public turn against him because they say he has control of the executive branch. His popularity has given him control basically of Congress. And if he gets control of the Supreme Court, there's a threat of dictatorship here. He is meddling in the constitutional separation of powers. And this is a big slap in the face to Roosevelt. I mean, even hardcore supporters of the New Deal argue against something like this. They say he's gone too far with this one. And there's a lot of political cartoons like this one where this is saying, Roosevelt is conducting interviews for who wants to get on the Supreme Court. And the only question is basically, are you going to do what I want? And anyone who wants to get on the court will say yes. So justice and the Constitution end up in the trash can. But this is a very popular idea. So this is one of the instances where Roosevelt has gone too far, and the public reacts against him very strongly. And in 1937, he has to do some things to regain popularity. So he starts pulling back on the government spending, because the criticism from the Republican Party especially is that the government's spending too much. It's going to bankrupt the country. So Roosevelt starts to reduce the spending. And you immediately see when he started all these programs in 33, unemployment was going down. It went down fairly consistently. When he slowed down the spending, when he started cutting the budgets for these employment programs, they start laying off workers. Those workers are not getting other jobs, so unemployment starts to go back up in 37 and 38.
So how is that helping his?
Well, the unemployment's not helping his popularity, but his image of, I'm actually a fiscal conservative. I don't want to go into debt to do all this stuff. This is just a small-time emergency, or a short-term emergency that we have to deal with. Says we don't want to keep spending this much money far into the future. So at some point, he's going to give in to the demand to cut the budget, cut the deficits. So he starts cutting the budgets, and immediately when he does, you see unemployment going up again. So he was politically popular amongst a lot of people for making the hard stand to try to eliminate the deficits. But once he did it, the reemergence of unemployment made him unpopular with others. Right? And that's the game that politicians play. I mean, if you're going to make a big decision, how much is this going to impact your popularity with the masses? I mean, you can afford to piss off some people as long as they're very few. And a lot of people and economists and just general average workers who see the rise of unemployment again start to think that, well, maybe this Great Depression isn't a short-term thing. Maybe this is going to go on and on and on. And there are some theorists who believe that this is just the way life is in the modern economy. 20% unemployment is normal. So there's a very emotional depression at this point. There's a very general fear that people are going to have to spend the rest of their lives in this kind of economy.
So 20% was normal for that time?
It was for the Depression, but 5 or 4% is normal in most growth periods. And you can see it written on this lady on the left, her face, as she looks at her child, and you can see it on her face, just wondering, is my child going to have to spend their entire life dealing with this? And people start thinking about the far-term future and what life is going to be like. And it's not a very happy picture. Yeah.
This question is a little off topic, but isn't there a series of photographs with that lady?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know if there's a series. I found that one and I liked it. Well, I didn't like it. It has an emotional pull, definitely. It'd be much better if someone is, hanging out in the sunshine with butterflies floating around. But that's not what we had. Okay. Going into the later 30s, especially going to 39 and 40, Roosevelt basically declares that he's going to continue spending money to keep people employed, but his major reform movement is over. He says, in the early 30s, my first term, we really pushed through the major changes to government that I had campaigned on. So he largely declares that the New Deal is petering out in the late 30s. So some major accomplishments of the New Deal. Number one, the powers of the presidency expand to a very large scale. And the president, Roosevelt, really took over the power of creating law. He forced his Democratic Party members in Congress through threat, intimidation, and the offer of political rewards, promotion, to get them to pass the laws that he wanted. Under the Constitution, the president's not supposed to be writing laws. The president's just supposed to enforce laws. But this is where you start seeing a further step in the process where presidents take on greater and greater leadership in creating laws, negotiating laws. Another of the major accomplishments is to give organized labor, unions, the right to form and have collective bargaining with their employers so that union members, the average kind of factory workers, will get a somewhat fair share of prosperity. And a lot of economists and historians identify this move as one of the major steps that creates a middle class in the country, in the United States. The middle class existed before that, but in a very small scale. There's a big separation between the rich and the poor, and there wasn't much in between. But this is where the working classes come to, or at least start taking steps toward, a greater prosperity for themselves. Another major accomplishment is the acceptance of the idea that it is the federal government's role to oversee the economy and to regulate it where necessary. And the idea that the economy should do whatever it wants, businesses should be allowed to do whatever they want, those ideas are largely identified as leading to the Depression in general. So there's a very large acceptance amongst the American population that the government has to take an active role to protect against future collapses, catastrophes for the average people. And that the federal government is responsible in some way of helping people who are injured or elderly who retire to keep them out of poverty and destitution. Some big failures, though, of the New Deal are also pretty prevalent. Number one, there are a lot of social groups that are cut out of New Deal benefits. Farmers don't get all that much. This is mostly focused on industry, factory employment. The elderly get Social Security, but otherwise they're pretty much overlooked in a lot of ways because they're not of working age. Roosevelt is obsessed with keeping people working when they're in their middle ages. And minorities do not profit off the New Deal almost at all. When you saw the pictures of the CCC or the people getting paychecks or something, they're almost never black, they're never Hispanic. These are white people who benefit. And not only do minorities not get many of the kind of employment benefits, there is no equality-driven legislation passed at all in this era. There's no civil rights passed for a long time. And Roosevelt is seen as one of the more liberal presidents in U.S. history, and he was unwilling to even really have these discussions very much. When he met with, say, black leaders, he kept those meetings fairly secret. He didn't want reports getting out into the press of it. And a lot of the government agencies that are employing people often just use racist tactics. They do not give jobs to minorities. And Roosevelt is really hamstrung. There's a lot of statements that he made kind of in private, not in front of microphones or anything, where he may have liked to have done something to help civil rights. But the Democratic Party dominates the South through voter intimidation. And this is the point in time where a lot of black people still voted Republican because Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. And they identify him as the person who ended slavery. I mean, very rightly, very correctly. So a lot of Democratic Party members fear if you actually allow minorities to vote that they'll vote Republican. And that Roosevelt's kind of national coalition will start to fall apart. So Roosevelt was unwilling to touch any kind of civil rights issues. And of course, in the end, the New Deal did not end the Depression. What does end the Depression? The war. The massively increased government spending, far beyond anything the New Deal did, to win the war. That employed far more people, and at the same time destroyed foreign industries almost completely. And Europe is flattened.